Hey everybody, this is Dr. Chris Dost. Welcome back to my channel, Biblical Languages and Literature. Before we get started with our video today, I just want to share with you a few new exciting things that are going on at Sabra Global Education. Beginning April 13th, Dr. Jeffrey García of Alliance University will be teaching the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament. This is a 4-week class that meets 1 hour per week, and in this video you'll get a taste of what that course is going to be about. Those who wish to sign up for the class but who cannot make the live class sessions, that's okay because the class sessions are recorded and uploaded to an online classroom for you to view at your convenience. For information on group discounts, please contact info@sabraedu.com, info@sabraedu.com. Beginning April 24th, Dr. Robert Harris of the Jewish Theological Seminary will be teaching the Book of Isaiah from yesterday to today. And this is an ongoing course that will meet indefinitely 1 hour per week. So if you're interested in getting to know the ins and outs of the Book of Isaiah from historical perspectives, Jewish perspectives, and Christian perspectives, this course is for you. Dr. Stephen Notley of Alliance University is teaching Jesus' parables as Jewish scripture. This course is already underway, but it's not too late to register. And as with the other courses, all of the class sessions are recorded and available to view through the online classroom. And for those who are looking for private lessons, whether it be in foreign languages, art, music, math, study skills, and more, please check out our online lessons and tutoring page to find your personal teacher today. Yeah, I remember, and I share this a lot with people now, but I remember being in my early 20s in seminary. And, when I went to seminary, it was really, I was a self-taught Greek student who just went for a few New Testament classes and,
Right.
More just to get some tools. And, then I got bit by the Hebrew bug and we know how that ended up. But I remember just in my excitement as being an early seminary student, sharing with, some people at church about books I was reading and just all this new information.
Yeah.
And in a evangelical church context, which is, what I found myself in.
Yeah.
The question that I most oftenly got was, is the author a believer? And, my, my thought has always been, does it matter?
Exactly.
Because I think in life, and you turn on the news, you read the newspaper. I mean, you go to just talk with friends. Nobody sees eye to eye on everything, and yet if we're open-minded enough, we can learn from people, even those people with whom we perhaps disagree with about the most fundamental issues. We can still learn from them. And sometimes those conversations, even though we end up on different sides of the proverbial aisle, even if our perspective is not changed through, discourse, we at least have a better understanding of why we believe what we believe.
Precisely.
And perhaps a deeper appreciation for why other people might disagree with us. So
Precisely.
Yeah. And I think, in my years as a professor too, and I think this was true of me coming in, is that I didn't understand what academia was really about. And it was actually Julie Cox, who's a professor at Alliance Theological Seminary at the time, who shared what one of her professors told her, and that it's that academia is a conversation. It's not about final answers, because there are no final answers. We deal with evidence, not proof. And so there's always, a more robust discussion to be had.
Right.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
It's like I told my class the other day. I'm doing a class on an in-person class on Dead Sea Scrolls and New Testament. And I tell them, I said, listen, in scholarship, in academia, as you say, we're not looking for the final answer. One, because we're academics. So either there is no final answer or we fear the final answer because that stops the conversation. Right. But I told them, I said, this is why, I think to be a responsible academic, there's a lot of perhaps and maybes in our conversation, because we're sometimes, depending who we're having a conversation with, we're interpreting the same set of materials, but we're seeing it from very different perspectives. Right. so that Julie Cox is 100% correct. This is a conversation. I mean, I remember taking chapters of my dissertation to Dr. Schiffman, and I'm looking for a straight answer. Just give me the one answer I need so I can go back home and continue writing, right?
Right.
And he'd start a conversation. But in that conversation is where I learned the most, right? It's in that give and take, question here, question there, question here. Where are we landing with this?
Right.
Let's keep the conversation going. This is where I'm getting some of the gems for my work, not only in terms of content, but in terms of methodology.
Yeah.
And for academics, both of those things are incredibly important. And I think because if you find yourself in a context where we have to sort of fill out these litmus tests, right? Is the author a believer? Did they land in this particular place because this is the only place to land? Then that stagnates questions. It stagnates understanding. It stagnates the conversation. As you said, I think the conversation is important, not only because you see people's different perspectives, but you get to understand that person is coming hopefully from an authentic place, and you get to know a little bit more about them.
Right.
And that is how communities are formed, right? So like in my class, I tell them, I said, listen, I am going to stir the pot. I am going to on occasion play devil's advocate. I am going to challenge you, but that is all because we are here to have a conversation.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about, we've talked about the Pharisees. You've done a lot of work with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the world of the Dead Sea Scrolls and all of that falls within your purview. So talk to us a little bit about the broader Jewish community outside just the Pharisees in the time of Jesus, and how, maybe an example or two of how you take that, that social and historical institutional knowledge of Judaism at that time, a multifaceted Judaism, and how you bring that to bear on the New Testament and it's your reading of it and its interpretation.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and we could be here for a long time. The outside the New Testament, of course, the New Testament for us, for people reading the New Testament, the groups that we primarily have in them, or at least explicitly stated, are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Right. Josephus gives us three: the first century historian, whom without we would not know as much as we do about that period of time. First century historian tells us there are Pharisees, Sadducees, and then there is this fourth group, the Essenes, right? And then he tells us, interestingly enough, that there is a fourth philosophy, but he doesn't describe them as a school or a group. And they're probably not a school or a group. They're probably somehow connected maybe to the Pharisees to some extent. And then in 1947, this cache of documents is found in 9 years of searching that is going to eventually be somewhere between 800 and 1,200 scrolls that we previously did not have, despite the fact, and the scrolls that I'm talking about, scrolls that are connected to a site called Qumran, okay? Because that search for scrolls ends up leading other people to find scrolls elsewhere in the desert. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, when we usually use that title, we're referring to a specific set that is related to a site called Qumran in the desert. Now, I won't bore you with the details. But I would say that this tells us about another community that we were previously unfamiliar with regard to their ideas. Now, we find that some of their ideas are parallel to things that we have elsewhere, because there is a cache of literature that we already have before the discovery of the scrolls that was written some point upwards of 200, 250 years before the New Testament, right? So they're parallel in idea, but it introduces a new group that is probably broken off from either the Sadducees or, this is the scholarly conversation, is broken up from the Sadducees, according to some scholars, and also a form of the Essenes that Josephus mentions in his literature. Okay. once the scrolls start to be deciphered over time, right? And start to be published, scholars begin to realize that this stuff is incredibly parallel to ideas that we have in the New Testament. Now, as far as we know, and I think this will stay the case, there is not a single copy among the many Dead Sea Scrolls of the New Testament. There is no evidence of the New Testament in any of the scrolls. However, what the scrolls tell us, which really sort of predate the time period of Jesus, is they give us pieces that allow us not only to see where Christian later New Testament ideas are coming from that are eventually going to become Christian ideas, but we also have places where Jesus and Paul are interacting and employing ideas that for the first time we have in the scrolls. We did have this before with other ancient literature. Among the Catholic tradition, they have, of course, the deuterocanonical books, which are referred to as the Apocrypha. So we already had an idea of what the early Jewish world looked like. The Dead Sea Scrolls are perhaps arguably the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century. And they, to a great extent, revolutionize how we understand early Judaism, and also how we understand the New Testament and rabbinic literature as well. For the New Testament, there are a couple places that stick out the most when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The first one is in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, you shall hate your enemy." That's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I tell you to pray for those who persecute you, right? Now, up to that point, we had no place where there was any Jewish group that would actually say to hate your enemy, right? All of a sudden, we find and decipher the community rule, which is a document that is central to this community that lived in the desert, perhaps the Essenes. They actually refer to themselves as the Yachad, the community, right? And at some point, you get to one of the columns and you read that the Sons of Light, which are this group that lives in the desert that is responsible for some of the copying and writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, say that you should hate the Sons of Darkness, which is everyone that is not part of their group. And essentially, in some scrolls, the Sons of Darkness are the enemies of the Sons of Light, right? And it basically says that you should hate them. Now, I would caution that we define the word hate in the way that we do in the modern period, but still, there is an indication that there is some antagonism between these groups, and that one group is saying that you should be an opponent to the other group in some regard. Right. So that when Jesus says this and he reverses and says, "I say something else, you shall pray for those who persecute you," so on and so forth, that we now know he's interacting with a confirmable idea that we have in the first century. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that without the Dead Sea Scrolls, that we can't say that Jesus is, this place in Matthew is something that Jesus interacting with that exists in the ancient world. However, for me, having the pieces, the evidence to look at makes it much more significant, because now I know that Jesus is engaging a group that is concerned with following the commandments correctly, very closely aligned with issues of ritual purity, and it gives me a whole nother set of data to look at that gives me greater understanding of what conversations the New Testament is portraying, what conversations Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is engaging. The other thing, which is interesting for the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's actually much more diverse than this, but there are places where the Apostle Paul in his letters, Romans, Galatians, Corinthians, and other places, will use language that prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls we may have had in a couple of places or we didn't have anywhere. And two of those phrases are, one, he uses Belial in Corinthians, and the second, he uses works of the law in Galatians. Now, Belial we have appearing in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, but we find that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Belial is their greatest spiritual antagonist, right? Belial and his lot. He is a demonic entity of the first century. And then we get to Romans and we see, Corinthians, and then we see the Apostle Paul say, does light have fellowship with darkness? Does Belial have fellowship with Christ? Right? Assuming that those two are opposed to each other. This is the same dichotomy we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sons of light, sons of darkness. Right? Belial, not in this case Christ, but Belial, his lot, versus whoever is God in his lot. Right? We have a similar dichotomy. In Galatians and Romans, Paul uses the term works of the law. Okay. Prior to that, we didn't know where this was coming from, and it deepens the conversation of what who's Paul's influences. There is a letter that we find among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is sent apparently to Jerusalem, and some have interpreted this letter as sort of the initial reason why this group forms. When they send the letter to Jerusalem, they basically say, "Listen," and this is the nutshell, the Cliff Notes version, let's say. The Jeffrey Garcia Cliff Notes version.
We have to leave people wanting more and coming back, right? Yeah.
This is the Cliff Notes. Basically, they say, you guys in Jerusalem are interpreting all the ritual purity commandments. These are commandments that have to deal with entering sacred space. You're doing it all wrong. And you're in Jerusalem. How could you? This instead is what you need to do. A, B, C, and D. Okay, now we don't know. We don't have the response letter. So we don't know how Jerusalem responded. The priests in Jerusalem, we don't know if they were like, well, we'll ignore them. Who cares about them? They're somewhere in the desert. But at the very beginning, it starts mentioning the way they describe these commandments. In Hebrew, it's miktzat ma'aseh Torah, which is some of the works of the law, right? And because of that, and a number of pieces that we have in the New Testament, we begin to ask ourselves the question, what did this early community of Jesus followers look like with regard to influences, people coming to faith in Jesus, joining this group? And how does this information that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls shed light on helping to understand aspects of the New Testament? Because remember,